Moved here with my 4 brothers and sisters and my parents, and I ended up being here until I was 18. Then I got out of town. I went to Australia, I went to Colorado, Hawaii, Washington, D.C. And then finally I ended up coming back here when my mom had Alzheimer's, stayed with her, and then I ended up moving back here to town. And I just kind of got interested in history. Both my parents were teachers. Our dad was an American history teacher. And so when we used to go on a lot of trips during the summertime, we used to stop at every little sign, you know, and go and stop and see it. And everybody's like, ugh. But actually, from that, I really learned that's really interested in history. So that's kind of what it started. All right, so today we're just going to talk about some of the schools in early Shakopee. And I start with this. This is what one of my nieces told me recently. But it's interesting because I went back and to him, and I said, you know, this is a picture of my dad's family. Dad is actually in the picture, but her mother is pregnant with my dad. And so he was the youngest of 9 children. They were farmers. Their parents were farmers. And the parents before them were farmers also. So it was farmer, farmer, farmer. And my dad was the youngest of 9, and as my brother Elmer used to say, he was not a good farmer. He didn't like farming. And he wanted to go on to school. And he ended up being the first person in the family to go to college. And it's kind of influence on going to the next generation, So we have all of my brothers and sisters all went to college. The next generation are going to college. So we think that's just a good thing. But my dad used to always say that college was the way, or really school was the way where he really learned about the world. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. But today we're talking about schools in Shakopee. And the first school that actually happened was actually in Eagle Creek, which technically at that time was not Shakopee. It actually wasn't even Shakopee at that point. It was called Prairieville. But it was the Pond Mission School. And that was the first schooling that happened. You're familiar with Samuel Pond, and his wife was Cordelia Eggleston Pond. They moved to this area which was called Tinta Otama, which is the Dakota village that was here before the white people came here. There were about 600 people who lived here in Shakopee, in Tinta Otama. And when Samuel Pond moved here, he took the name Tinta, which is prairie, and Otama, which means village, and he called the place Prairieville. And they had a house, and the house was both the house as well as a school for people. And they said that both Samuel and his wife Cordelia taught the Dakota children in the Dakota language at the mission school. In other words, they weren't speaking English, they were speaking Dakota. And they ended up making books that Samuel Pond and his brother did, where they'd have the words in English as well as in Dakota. And they used that to do that. And they say that there were, for 6 years, starting in 1847, the Indians had gathered in various numbers each Sabbath to learn the white man's religion, and the little children had gathered each day for religious instruction. So most of their teaching was probably tied into the Bible. And they said, you know, the numbers was never large. There weren't a lot of children there. There were some, and once in a while, I know there was one Dakota Indian round wing who actually removed some children at one point. But there were some that did. And eventually, the school was actually established by Miss Cunningham as a teacher. It's interesting when you look at several different books about the history, they talk about Miss Cunningham, but they never name what her first name is, so we just call her Miss, okay? And it's interesting because when they started that school, there was a real opposition to starting the school, especially by the traders. They thought that if the Dakota learned to compute, you know, in other words, they do math, then there would be problems for the traders because they have to follow the rules, I suppose. Okay. In fact, there was one thing that said, I think the history of the Minnesota Valley, they said that the Dakota was at the mercy of the shrewd traders. An educated Dakota would be able to know their rights and assert them. And one trader actually said to Samuel Pond, he said, it would take $100 out of each profit each time a person learned to read. So just kind of interested in the process. All right. We continue on and we'll talk about then Eliza Faribault. And she was one of the daughters of Oliver Faribault and his wife, who was Wakanyanka, who was a Dakota Indian. And Eliza attended schools at the Eagle Creek Township in a little log cabin. We're not sure if it's the same one that this, the pond was at, and we just went over there or not. We think probably. But we do know that by 1856, there were 7 schools in the Eagle Creek area, which is just interesting. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a list of where they are and what they are. We don't know that. I just know that there were 7 things. And Eliza, when she was 14 years old, that was in 1859, she was taken to Quebec City, and she attended a school conducted by the nuns. Okay, and they probably were teaching in French. Okay. And Eliza actually remembered at one point and wrote down, she said, we traveled from Faribault to Hastings by stage, and then we took a steamboat to La Crosse. And from La Crosse we traveled by train, and it was the first time I ever rode in a railroad train. And she said, I don't remember the cities we went through, but I clearly recall our arrival in Quebec. It seemed unreal to me as I had never before been away from the frontier. And again, she was there for just 2 terms, and then she returned home to Prairieville or Shakopee. You can imagine when you think about that, what an experience. I can just imagine. I mean, I often think, boy, I wish she was around to talk more about it. It'd be really interesting to find out. Okay, the first public school in Shakopee was in 1854. They say it was in the fall of 1854. Mary Jane Turner opened the first school. But unfortunately, so far I've been looking, I haven't found the location of where it was. But we know that that was the first school that happened. I was looking at basically the history of the Minnesota Valley as well as the Shakopee story to find out what we could find. District 2 opened in the fall of 1854, and the school was taught at Mr. Stemmer's house by Mrs. Dr. Lord. And that's when I read these things, I started laughing because, like, first of all, what was her first name? You know, and of course, they never tell what her maiden name was. But anyway, Mrs. Doctor was it was obviously the Dr. Lord was an important one. But we do know that if that was going on, that we knew that the school was happening. And that District 1 organized also in 1854. The first school was taught in 1855 by John H. Brown. And it was in the second story of the old post office building. Does anybody know where the old post office building is?
I think it was on
Home Street? No. Home Street?
Yeah.
That's my guess too, but I wasn't sure. Okay. Mainly because that was probably the only street in town at that point. So anyway.
No, there were two.
Well, there were two. I know that's true.
But I distinctly remember one of my older siblings telling me that that was where the post office was.
That was where it was. So
They
yeah.
pointed.
Was it on the north or the south side?
It was on the west side of Home.
Oh, on Home Street, right? Okay.
Yeah.
On the west side.
West.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. And I did a little bit just, because we're talking about Shakopee, and there was this area that was Shakopee, but we had these other townships all around. And they had schools too, and some of them now are becoming the bigger Shakopee area. So, for example, Louisville Township started in 1856. It was in a house, then it was in a brick building, then for a few years there was no school, and then until 1865 it was in a brick building. That was it. I think that was the last one that they had in Louisville. In Jackson Township, in 1868, remember that at that time, Jackson Township was part of Shakopee, which it kind of is now too. But at that time it was until 1871, and then it became a separate Jackson Township. But there was a frame schoolhouse was built. The first school was taught that winter by Joseph Plumer. 43 scholars enrolled. There were 76 that were in the district, so some of them weren't going to class. And they say in that area, in 1875, the school burnt down, so they built a new one the following fall. In the winter, there were 25 scholars, and that was the only schoolhouse in Jackson Township. Now, of course, there is a school called Jackson Elementary School, right? So you see. The other one that's kind of really interesting is St. Gertrude's Convent and Academy by the Sisters of St. Benedict's. They was incorporated in 1866. This was probably the first higher education schooling, beyond elementary school that happened. And they know that there were three sisters, Sisters Clara, that's the next one, and Adelaide. I'm worse, but since I had my stroke, I can never say it right, so I think why bother saying it. But anyway, these three people were from the Benedict Convent in St. Joseph at St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. And they arrived here in Shakopee in 1862. And they founded the convent and the academy. And I'll show you a picture in just a sec. But in a letter to King Ludwig of Bavaria, the abbot said that they founded a little mission for the sisters to the great joy of the English and German Catholics. The new convent has its own story. First, it was built, or was in a cowshed, then a horse barn, and now it's become the convent. So that's kind of interesting, the process of what happened. And yes, eventually they have a house and a building. Look at this. And this was both the school and the convent both. And some of you may remember this because this later became the poorhouse, and then eventually became, well, I think then the school, I mean, this,
In the hospital.
then the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In a poorhouse.
and the poorhouse, yeah. Okay, so that was on the corner of 4th and Atwood Street, just south of St. Mark's Church. And the first commencement exercise took place on June 20th, 1871. And by the September 4th of 1871, the Academy had an enrollment of 46 young ladies. Now, one question you might have, as I would, where are the men? They're obviously not in school. All right.
They're farming.
Now remember that at this point too, the board and tuition for the season was $40. Bedding and laundry was $5. Piano lessons was $8. And guitar lessons were $3. And if you want lessons in cloth, wax works, and the making of paper flowers, that was extra. So it's just kind of interesting, the process. But we know that the sisters of St. Benedict's there were able to staff St. Mark's parochial school, which was started at about that time, and for a while the public schools in the settlement. So the nuns ended up teaching both the public school and the private school for a short time. And obviously they did well because by mid-1878, the debt at the convent was practically paid off. So people were really thrilled, right? It was working well, it was going well, and then, oops,
Yes.
a priest in St. Mark's, Father Platt said, he was pastor, and he was very intensely German, okay? And he decided in 1878 to refuse to re-employ the Benedict sisters as teachers at St. Mark's School because he felt that they were not able to teach German properly.
The real
Yes.
truth is,
Yes.
he could not tolerate strong-minded women.
I believe that 100%. I think that is true.
Absolutely.
I believe, without a doubt.
I read Jack Collar's book.
Yes.
His father idolized Father Cliff. But then I read a book written by one of the nuns at St. Benedict, and he actually refused them a pew in church.
Yes, in fact, I think that's coming up next.
Not always a nice person.
Yes, I don't think he was I think he wasn't very Christian-like. Okay, there was an antagonism between them, okay? And at one point, yes, the priest refused for allowing the nuns to have pews in the church. And that was just not right. All right? Don't allow the nuns in the church. Anyway, at that time, there were about 30 sisters staffing the academy, convent, and 3 schools in Minneapolis, Carver, and Belle Plaine, and also an orphanage in St. Paul. Okay. But the father replaced the Benedictine sisters with the School Sisters of Notre Dame from Milwaukee in May of 1878. And Mother Gertrude, which was with the old group, right? He was admired, and she did well. I mean, she got financial things, doing well, everything. But Bishop passed over her and picked someone else. So eventually, the Bishop Ireland advised the sisters that St. Gertrude was suppressed and that the 30 sisters needed to move out and go to St. Joseph, Minnesota at the St. Benedict's Convent, or get rid of their vows. And so they did. For the most part, they all then moved to St. Joseph, and now you have St. Benedict's, you have the school there, St. John's, St. Ben's, right? They should have stayed there in Shakopee. But anyway. Because they said that St. Gertrude's Convent and Academy was from 1862 to 1880. Because once they had that, they basically, it was the end of it. And there is a note from Abbot Alexis, who noticed that they believed that the women, the nuns, felt that they were wrong. And in my impression, that they were wrong. Okay. So that was the end of the school here in Shakopee at that point. Pretty sad when you think about it, too. Mm-hmm. All right. Another school that was happening around the same time in 1872 to 1875 was the Minnesota Valley Academy. Okay. It was opened on September 5th, 1872, and it was the Episcopal Reverend who started it. He was the rector, the teacher of Latin, mental and moral philosophy, and rhetoric. And Ella L. Smith taught mathematics, history, and natural science. And Hattie Smith taught music. And again, it's just kind of interesting in terms of the costs there at that point. They said the tuition and board was $160 per year, except for music. And the day scholars paid $25. And they got an extra charge of $36 per year for music, plus $10 for the use of the piano. I just found that so interesting. That piano must have really loved having that, okay. Made some good money off that piano. Okay. But it's interesting because when they closed at the end of, in the spring of 1875, they closed the door and it just never opened after that. There's no real reason for that I know of, okay. Yes.
Do you know where it was located?
Do you know where it was located? I don't either. I mean, I looked and I couldn't find it. But I was, I'm guessing it was probably close to where the Episcopal school
St. Peter's Episcopal
Church was there.
And that was across the street from the bottling works.
Yeah, okay. By the bottling works right across the street there. That would be my guess, that it might be right within the whole thing, but I don't know for sure. The Argus also noted that Shakopee needed a high school. They mentioned that the girls could provide higher education and refinement at St. Gertrude's. Of course, they closed that one down, but the boys were not so fortunate. And so if we look at the city of Shakopee, there were actually 3 schools that served Shakopee. District 1 was the stone building, and that one burnt down in 1880, I think. District 2 was called the White School. That's such a strange thing, but I think it's just the building's color was white. I'm thinking because, but it became the residence of the Didi's family eventually. And District 41 was on 4th Street. I think it was more west, okay? And it was there as a district until 1918, and then it was destroyed in 1935 after being condemned. They said it was a hazard to life and limb. And it's just interesting because that, which really they started District 41 in 1870. The teacher was C.W. Smith. They had 35 boys and 22 girls. And they said, you know, of course, that after they did like a test at the end of the year, and they said that it showed great credit on both teachers and pupils. And it's also interesting because the teacher clearly was also a math teacher too, because he actually had, according to the Shakopee stories, they actually have, at the end of the past page of record for the term, this notation: total loss by tardiness, 5,992 minutes. This is how many days, how many hours, total attendance. It just kept interesting. That's a math person. And there's a picture of 1870, the school district. Okay. But the one that is probably most important to know is the Union School. Okay. And that was built in 1881. That school now is still there. You know where it is? Anybody know? It's Central. What used to be Central School.
Oh, okay.
Before then it was, now it's, I think it's the Family
Family Center.
Center.
Central Family Center.
Central, yeah. Here, I got it here.
We just rebuilt it.
And that's where you went to high school. Yeah, so there you go.
So did I.
You too, okay. Okay, so the city of Shakopee consolidated District 1 and 2, and then they built the Union School. It was located 1 block south of Old District 1 and west of St. Mary's School. And so now it's the one that you can see now is the Central Family Center on 505 Home Street South. And it's interesting because as a school, it's a really interesting school anyway. I used to go there for band lessons. I used to go to St. Mary's, but we'd go over for band at that school. And what I remember is that at that time, the band was in the room that had the mural of Shakopee.
Mm-hmm.
And it still is a beautiful mural, and it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth going just for that, I think. Okay. The building was open for classes on January 10th, 1882. And the Professor Giles was the principal. Fanny Barnes was head of the grammar department. And Mabel Patterson and Mary O'Brien taught the primary department. I know. And they said it was a very elegant building at that time, that people really talked a lot about that building when it was built. And probably one of the reasons was because they used desks instead of a bench. So it used to be, when you went to school, they would just be a long bench and you'd sit on that. And here they actually used desks, and that was just unbelievable. And here are the first high school graduates. They graduated in 1898, Ida and Anna. And here again is the building. And what happened with the building is over time, it changed several times. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's just good to see what it looked like. And the people, this was in the assembly room. Looks like a lot of people, but anyway. And they looked really serious. Of course, next they also had the sewing room. And that was back when I think only women were allowed to sew. I know when I was in school here in Shakopee, they required us to take both shop and sewing and whatever. I remember making something and it was bad, but anyway, it was a good concept. And here's the high school class in 1912. This is the junior, their junior in high school. Now, it'd be interesting because, you know, we don't have the list of who's who in here. And I haven't found a lot of that, but I'm, you know, we'll continue to look. It'd be really interesting to find out who some of these people are. Okay, so this is a school in 1920. And by 1951, the same building now, but they've taken down parts and add something. This is one section, here's the other section. So this is kind of, if you go drive down there now on Home Street, you would see this, it looked pretty much similar to this, although now there's a playground and things like that there.
And that's me.
Are you in there?
Far left.
This one?
Yep.
Oh, wow. So what year was this, do you think?
Well, I graduated in 59, so it might have been 58, 57 in there.
Well, interesting. Do
'Cause
you
I
know who
think-
the other people are here?
I know some of them. The one
Some.
right next to me is Karen Klein, and then there's Connie Noterman is about a little further over, and I can't see the rest.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I also was looking, because there's a, online, if you go on the computer now, at the Shakopee Heritage Society, there's actually information published by Chris Kirker, I think his name is, how to say, K-I-E.
I think it's Keeker.
Keeker, okay. And he did the history of Shakopee's first high school, and it has some good information in there. It's online, so you can see it. And there was part of the thing that showed, like, for example, the library that was there. And it does show the auditorium before that was removed in 1969. And if you look, this is from like above in 1965, but this is where the thing is. And you just, there's numbers because there was in 1929, they added the auditorium, gymnasium, library, and classroom above the gym. And then in 1950, they added the dining room, library, locker room, showers, elementary, junior high, and industrial arts and home ec classes. In 1960, they added the library and 6 additional classrooms. Okay.
Lavatory,
and if you look at number 4, and the thing which is over there was the pre-1929 structure, which was demolished in the 1950s structure. So that's why if you look at the old pictures of the high school, it looks very different than what it looks like now. And that's because they tore down a lot of the, what I thought was kind of very, very nice thing. And then eventually it moves up to the high school, which is now the West Middle School. Remember, they've changed that just this last year again. So, and it's changed because this is back then, but then of course they added the auditorium. They ended up later adding a swimming pool, things like that, added more classes and stuff. Okay? Another interesting school was the St. John's Parish School in 1882. And if you look down downtown on First Avenue, where you see what's now Atlas Staffing, used to be a school. It used to be the church there. And right next to that was where the school was. They spoke only German there, okay? They taught in German. And it's just nice because they, it's an interesting building, but we'll talk about it more. Because you can actually go and see that building. It's not there, it's in the landing here in Shakopee. So if you go into the landing area, there is a school, example of a school. That school is that German Lutheran school. So if you go there, they don't say that. So you go in there and I say, well, one time I went in there, actually I was taking pictures, and I asked the teacher. I said, why aren't you speaking German? She said, well, really? I said, but you know, if you want to be authentic to what it was back then, they spoke German. And in the board where it's written in English, it should actually be in German also. My thinking, you know, you gotta be sick. And you know, but it is it's a nice school, and if you go to the landing, you'll see it. It's a nice thing. It's just note that it is, it's the same one that they had downtown, and they actually moved it to the landing, so that's better than tearing it down. I do have just a couple of quick ones I want to show. This is Helena Public School, which is not right in this area either, but it's close. But again, it's just this little small little thing. This was in 1895. And this is, of course, the Marshall School in 1898. And you know where the Marshall School is located? Well, you probably know where it was. You probably, is that the one you visited, I think, also?
I'm not that old. My dad would know.
Oh. Have you ever, is that the one that you looked in that building? Or no?
No, that was more
Another one?
east.
More east, okay. Okay. So this was west of 17 on Hillside Road on the south side. And this is, they're just showing who a couple people are that we know there, but again, we don't really have a lot of who they are. And there's actually one, this is in the newspaper, again, in 1910, showing people who were there. Unfortunately, it doesn't know each one in order, it just has names of people who were there. So if you look at some of the names, you'll see things like Beckwith, Smith, I should say, Marshall, Majerus, O'Laughlin, you know, so you see some Klein. So, you know, there's a lot of things, but we don't know who is which of this, but it's just interesting to know that.
And where
And it
was
would
the
be
school
nice
supposed
to
to have
see
been?
that.
Off of Marshall Road?
Yeah.
Hillside Drive.
Where is
Just
it?
by the, you said Hillside Drive?
Hillside, yeah, Hillside
So it's
Drive.
like by the farm, the east side of Marshall.
Okay.
That
And
development.
this is just one I just picked because I just was adding and thinking, this is the Eagle Creek School. I remember there were 7 different schools in Eagle Creek, so I don't know which one this was. I don't know anything more about this. I just want to add just the idea that it was there. The other ones that were left that I wanted to mention, first of all, St. Mark's Parochial School. That started in 1883. And again, it looked like that at that time, okay? I'm just going to show a couple examples of what it looked like. This was in about 1895. And they've got desks, so that's good, okay? They look very attentive. This was in 1943, and this one looks a little bit more like what you see now.
Yeah, that was brand new.
And in the back there, of course, is St. Mark's Church. And I kind of like this picture. This is the St. Mark's students in 1896. They just look like, I don't know, as a teacher, I'd be like, if that was my class, I'd be like, oh Lord.
Especially that one in the middle.
I just like the look. I mean, that's reality, but it's kind of fun to
The
see.
one next to him looks like his jacket's a little tight.
Yeah. It's nice to see, actually. I mean, I actually like pictures like that, but it'd be nicer to have the names. This is St. Mark's School IV department in 1896.
That'd be like a 4th grade.
That's what I think, but I'm not sure. Remember, I was just putting this together last night, so.
So I'm thinking the IV is 4.
That was in 4th grade? I think so too, probably. But again, it would be really nice to find some names of some of the people, and I'm guessing some of them we could probably can find if we really look. Here's St. Mark's School in 1901. That's a lot, that'd be a fun class to teach, I'm
Big
sure.
class, right? That class.
It's a pretty big class,
Yeah.
isn't it? I think it is.
Unless it was a whole school.
And then here just shows more what it looks like now. Now, you know that St. Mark's School is now no longer located there. St. Mark's and St. Mary's and the one in Marystown moved out, and now we have the Shakopee area Catholic schools on 17th Street. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. All right. So St. Mary's Catholic School started in 1935. They had St. Mary's this, church there, and the priest there purchased the rest of the block. And now the place is called the Henderson, if you know where that is. Okay. He bought the rest of the block for $2,500, and they built a 4-room school. And it was opened in 1935 with 98 pupils. What's interesting about this is that a lot of people who lived near St. Mark's went to school in St. Mary's. But there's a reason for that. This was the Depression. Okay? If you go to St. Mark's, you had to pay for the books and things like that. St. Mary's, it was free. So, a lot of people who even lived like right next door to St. Right, a block from that, walked over and went to St. Mary's to school because it was cheaper. If you don't have money, you don't have money coming in at that time, right?
St.
That's what
Mark's
you did.
also had tuition,
They had tuition too, yeah.
and if somebody had 8 to 10 kids in school.
Right, like
It
yours.
got expensive, right.
Yeah, it got expensive. I remember even with my mom and dad when we were going to St. Mary's, you know, they were charging tuition. They would go, you get each child, you get less tuition because there'd be like 6 of us at the time in the same school. So it'd go a little down, but it was still very expensive to my family, I think. Okay, so this is just interesting. This is in 1939, but it just shows the 8th grade graduation. It's not the best picture, but I just like it because it shows, again, some of the people whose names you hear, like George Huss, Dorothy Scherer, I think it is, Delwos, Ladiswell, which is Mildred and Richard Smith. And I like this picture because it shows the students at students in 1945. They're going from church to school. And I just remember this because this is mine. We used to do this all the time. I don't know what if Wednesday or something, you'd always have to go to church first and then walk over to things. So here you have the little nuns here going along and taking them across the things, so it's just kind of nice.
Dave, when I went to St. Mary's School, we went to church every day.
Every day. Yeah, that's interesting. So I remember doing, I think it was just once a week,
Yeah.
except for holy days, and then they would, add those to. All I remember is trying to behave and getting in trouble a lot because you can't talk to each other or do anything with the people next to you. Okay, there was an addition was built in St. Mary's in 1950. Another was built in 1965, 64, 65, I think that is. And in 1970, the parish of St. Mary's, St. Mark's, and St. Mary's of Purification in Marystown combined for the Shakopee area Catholic schools. So I remember I was in 5th grade, we went to St. Mark's. But it went up through 5th grade, and then you go to St. Mary's, which was Saks also, but for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I remember being there for 5th, then 6th, 7th, and 8th. Then we go to junior high, but at that time, there wasn't enough, they didn't have a school there. They were trying to get a bond issue, they didn't get it, so we had to do split shifts. So you were at the high school, which was now the middle school, and you had, you do morning from 6 in the morning until noon, and then the other one was 12:30 until 5, I think. That was when I remember doing that for a while, before the other building was built. So here again is St. Mary's. And this is once they were consolidated, the thing consolidated together, and they're just playing outside, which I love those uniforms. What I really liked about it, for me, was they used to have those uniforms for the girls, but the boys could wear whatever they want.
Right.
They've changed that now, but at the time I used to think, while I was there, I would think, this is so wrong. I mean, it just wasn't fair. Like, what the heck? You know, I didn't mind, you know. And I remember saying this one time, too, just because I remember that merry-go-round that used to be there. I think people would throw up afterwards, but it was fun. All right, so that gives you just a little idea of the schools. Now that's only going up to this point. So after that, they ended up adding more schools, more elementary schools. Then they added the middle school, which became the junior high, now it's middle school. Now they added a second middle school, and now they have a new high school on 17th Street. So I'm not going beyond that because I said I was just doing early schools, but I just wanted to know that it continued on, and now I think we have, I want to say 12 schools here in Shakopee now, including the learning center that's at what used to be the old mall here. And at this point, I think it's okay for a while. Eventually, they're probably going to have to add some more schools at some point if it continues to grow. Okay. And then just so you know, we do have books and stuff for sale. There's more books coming out. This is what I'm kind of working on. That's why I'm doing last minute with this thing, because I'm working on some other books that are coming out. And there's more coming also. We are trying to get a little bit more emphasis on parts that are missing in some of the books. So the Shakopee story is a great history of Shakopee up to about 1958. But they also miss, for example, the women. There wasn't a lot of research about them in there. There's a little, but not a lot. There's not a lot about people of color, even though we do know that, for example, the Dakota were here first. We also know that there were African Americans. I think there were at least 19 African Americans who lived here in Shakopee before 1900s. We know that Asian people arrived here about 1898. And so on. So we want to keep looking at that and expanding that. That's probably what the Shakopee Heritage Society is trying to do. Just so you know, Shakopee Heritage Society is not the same as the Scott County Historical Society. They're two groups. We work together, but we are two separate things. Shakopee we're just focusing on the city of Shakopee and the area around it, whereas Scott County does everything in Scott County. And then finally, we do have the first signs up in Memorial Park. If you're ever down to Memorial Park and you're over by the duck pond area, you'll see the first 3 of the signs. There will be a total of 10 signs plus another 10 others that will focus on the Dakota, the Pond family, and the Faribault family. And those signs are up, and you're willing to see it. They're going to be putting a bottom thing on here, but just so you know, they are around. And we are doing a fundraiser coming up this Thursday if you're interested. It's $40 a ticket. but the money goes towards building more signs. We're eventually going to do signs into downtown Shakopee. If you need, we get tickets here if you want it. And then finally, let's see. Oh, so if you want to go online, there's more information about Shakopee Heritage Society. So in the website or whatever, you can get more information. If you have questions, you can call or you can email, and we will respond within a day or two. And finally, on the paper that I just passed out that just had the information, if you look in the back, if there's one that has an S on it, I hope it's there. Is there an S one somewhere? No? Well, I guess
It's one secret password.
all right, well, I was hoping to do it, yes, I don't know where that one is. So instead, we're gonna do, let's see. Today is September 11th. Was anyone born on September 11th? 12, 13, 14, 15. Raise your hand if you get 16. September 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30. I didn't remember. 30? All right. Here, this is a good book. This is a collection of early pioneers in 1925. It's a good book. So, thank you again for coming. And again, there's information if you want to look at. And the next one that's coming up, I think, is on the calendar. I don't know what's coming up next. But the first thing coming up, of course, is this Thursday with
Holmes Landing.
yeah, the next one coming up is about Holmes Landing in 1851. All right. Thank you again. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dave. Very valuable.